Welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're doing something really exciting. We are peeling back the layers on some of the most debated, honestly spectacular imagery in the entire Bible, the famous 1,000 years mentioned in Revelation 20. We're going to be walking through a really fascinating document titled Reflection on the 1,000 Years, and we'll explore the structure underneath this incredibly complex text. So let's just start with the absolute massive questions sitting right at the center of this whole debate. Is this 1,000-year reign of the Messiah a literal futuristic event? Like, is a stopwatch literally going to start ticking down here on Earth? Or is it something entirely different? Could it be a spiritual reality that's actually happening right now? Well, the source material we're unpacking today makes a really strong, structurally sound argument for that second option. And by the end of this explainer, you're going to see exactly how they build that case.
Okay, let's dive right in. To really wrap our heads around this text, we have to look at the original Greek word for revelation, which is apocalypsis. You know, too often our modern culture hears the word apocalypse and immediately thinks of, like, a doomsday puzzle or some global catastrophe. But as our source points out, it literally just means to pull back a curtain or to remove a veil. It's about making a hidden spiritual reality visible. Remember, this book was originally a pastoral letter. It was written to severely persecuted churches in the first century, pulling back the veil to encourage them that, despite their immense suffering, the Messiah was already reigning.
Now, to really grasp Revelation, we've got to zoom out a bit. The source actually describes Genesis and Revelation as the two grand bookends of the Bible. They hold this entire overarching narrative together. Think about it. Genesis shows us how everything was perfectly created by Elohim, and then, well, how it broke. Revelation, as that final bookend, is a mirror image showing how everything is completely restored. It's the ultimate conclusion to the long historical struggle that we see throughout the rest of the Bible.
And that brings us to a totally foundational rule from our source document. This is going to govern everything we talk about today. Because Revelation is an apocalyptic text, its imagery, the numbers, the beasts, the dragons, it is inherently and highly symbolic. It's not literal. And beyond that, it's not an independent document, so you can't just interpret it in a vacuum. The meaning of all this rich imagery has to be drawn from the rest of Scripture that precedes it. Basically, if you try to read it like a literal newspaper, well, you're going to miss the point entirely.
Now, what's really interesting here is how our source maps this out visually. They argue there's an overarching spiritual reality at the top, this heavenly dimension where the Messiah is already ruling with absolute authority. Meanwhile, down below, we see the intense battle exactly as we experience it right here on Earth. This dynamic perfectly captures what John was doing, He was pulling back the curtain on our earthly chaos to reveal this highly ordered, victorious reality up in heaven. So, this creates a really distinct timeline with three dimensions in play. First, you have the past. The Messiah has already conquered through his death and resurrection. Second, there's the present. He is reigning right now from a heavenly kingdom, even while the church continues to struggle here on earth. And third, the future, that final restoration where believers are brought back to an Eden-like state. It's kind of an already but not yet motif. We are literally living in the ongoing process of restoration. It's super fascinating when you look at the theological progression here. In the Gospels, the title Son of Man really emphasizes the Messiah's humble humanity, right? And his ultimate suffering as the Lamb. But fast forward to the apocalyptic vision of Revelation, which actually connects all the way back to the ancient prophecies of Daniel, and that exact same Son of Man is now portrayed in this glorified royal majesty. He isn't just ruling, he's the judge of all the earth. All right, so here is the absolutely crucial point we need to hit today. When we get to Revelation 20 and we read about 1,000 years, the source heavily argues we're not looking at a futuristic, literal countdown clock. Because Revelation is highly symbolic, this number is actually a figurative description of our current age. It's the entire expansive period of time right between the Messiah's first coming, when he conquered death, and his second coming. It represents his present, ongoing spiritual reign as king. And to prove that numbers shouldn't always be treated like literal mathematics, the author points to this fantastic verse from Psalm 50. When the Creator says he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, does that mean the cattle on hill number 1001 somehow belong to someone else? No way, of course not. Throughout Scripture, the number 1,000 is frequently used symbolically. It denotes fullness, completeness, or just a vast period of time determined by Elohim, rather than a strict unit on a calendar. And honestly, this brilliantly illustrates one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of Revelation, the binding of Satan. Binding does not mean Satan is completely powerless or eliminated from the board.
Instead, the source argues it's a limitation of a very specific function. Because of the Messiah's victory, Satan can no longer prevent the gospel from leaving Israel and spreading to all the Gentile nations. The good news is successfully reaching the ends of the earth, which is a process that officially ignited at Pentecost.
Now, you're probably thinking, well, if Satan is bound, why is there still so much suffering going on? The author is very careful to address our real-world experience here. Good and evil still coexist. The source actually references John 16:33 to remind us that the reality of tribulation remains until the very end. So the binding of Satan guarantees the ultimate success of the global gospel mission, but it definitely does not guarantee a pain-free existence for believers right now.
So this actually leads us into a pretty major theological clash. The source takes direct aim at a highly popular viewpoint known as premillennialism. You might be familiar with this. It's often associated with dispensationalism. It reads Revelation literally and expects a future, physical, 1,000-year kingdom on earth where the Messiah sits on a literal throne in Jerusalem. According to our author, this creates a massive problem because it entirely misinterprets the biblical timelines. So we essentially have two contrasting views sitting on the table. Premillennialism, which is waiting for a literal future earthly kingdom, and then amillennialism, which the source argues firmly for, which sees a symbolic current heavenly kingdom. The author argues that premillennialism's literal earthly view simply doesn't correspond with how the Gospels and Paul's letters already explain the kingdom. Expecting a literal political kingdom kind of contradicts the whole spiritual foundation laid out in the rest of the New Testament. In fact, the author uses the Messiah's own words to dismantle the idea of a future earthly political empire. In John 18:36, he explicitly states, "My kingdom is not of this world." The document argues that explaining the 1,000 years as a future earthly reign actively contradicts this statement. Think about it. If the Messiah came to establish a heavenly spiritual kingdom, we really shouldn't be waiting around for him to return just to set up an earthly political one. Which brings us to a massive foundational takeaway from our explainer today. A major doctrine should literally never be built on a single, highly symbolic passage, like Revelation 20, without heavy confirmation from the rest of Scripture. The author insists that Revelation doesn't come to say anything brand new. It's not rewriting the Gospels, and it's not rewriting Paul's letters. Instead, it visually and dramatically illustrates the exact same truths that the New Testament is already teaching. So what does this all mean for us? It leaves us with one final, deeply practical question. If the author is right, if the 1,000 years is actually a symbol of the already but not yet era we are living in right this very second, and if the Messiah is currently reigning from a heavenly kingdom that is not of this world, how does that change your focus? How does realizing the curtain has been pulled back change the way you live, work, and persevere through tribulations today? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep seeking the truth, and I'll see you next time.